Hola, ¿cómo están? Estamos iniciando un nuevo programa, más allá de nuestras raíces. Estamos muy felices porque vamos a tener la oportunidad de conocer muchísima gente, amigos entrañables, amigos lejanos, amigos de acá, y todos tienen un punto de unión con nosotros, una conexión, y lo que queremos hacer es llevar esto más allá, llevarlo a distintas fronteras, llevarlo a distintas personas, a que puedan conocer mucho más y saber un poco más de nosotros, pero por supuesto, yendo más allá de nuestras raíces. Bienvenidos. El día de hoy tenemos a un gran amigo, muy cercano, muy querido. Es un gran chef, es franco-palestino, Fadi Kattan. Vive en Belén, tiene un restaurante, Fauda, y tiene un hotel maravilloso, encantador, en el medio de la ciudad. Es un lugar de ensueño. Estuvimos por allá con él hace un par de años antes de la pandemia y siempre he tenido las ganas de poder tenerlo a él con nosotros, de que esté aquí, porque también está muy relacionado con todos nosotros en Chile. Bienvenido, Fadi.
Thank you, Andrea. It's such a pleasure to be speaking to you and to all of our communities in Chile.
It's great to have you here. You're a very, very close friend of ours. And it was a dream for me to have you here with us because, food is part of our culture and it's part of our daily life. And what makes us different, what keeps us alive, and what gives us our sense of belonging.
And I'm really happy to be with you, especially with Chile, because I think food is one of the things that our great great grandparents took with them to Chile, and they preserved it from generation to generation. And the link, the strength of that link is really there with the food. It's with marmaon from Bethlehem. It's with knafa, and I think it's fabulous.
Tell us about your origin because it's fascinating and it's I don't know, it's like a travel from almost an Ibn Battuta travel. Your family goes around the whole world.
Actually, it's very similar to a lot of people that are in Chile today. Bethlehem and Palestine in the late 1800s and early 1900s was under Ottoman rule. The economic situation was not good, and then there was the build-up to the First World War, and that's why a lot of families left Palestine. In my case, on my father's side, my great grandfather um, had five boys, and he basically told the boys, "Look, it seems military service is going to be coming soon, so you should look at other opportunities." And so one of them landed in Chile, one of them landed in Manchester, one in the Sudan, and my grandfather and his other last brother went to Japan because we were in textile. The family name Kattan means cotton maker, and I think the name was given based on the trade. And so my grandparents, grandmother, and grandfather lived in Japan until 1943 when the Americans bombed Japan, and they ran away to India. And my father was born in India. And then in 1953, they came back. On my mother's side, my grandfather was born in France, and they came back to Bethlehem. So I was lucky to grow up in these three cultures, I would say, with three languages at home, English, French, and Arabic. And yeah, I don't feel I am like Ibn Battuta, but I do think all Palestinians from Bethlehem are like Ibn Battuta. The stories of people who I've met that are today living in Chile but landed in the Caribbean to start with and ended up ending in Chile, people that landed in Colombia and stayed or then went off to. So I think this is really, there's one thing which is essential to the identity of the people from this part of the world. We were all in trade, commerce, and from the small dukan, as we say now, the small shop in the market in Bethlehem, to the more established businesses, they were all people who were trading, and that's where today in our community in Chile, you see very diverse sectors of activity where you have Palestinians or people of Palestinian origin present.
And I was thinking about the melting pot you are, because you have brought in so many cultures. How about from your uncle's side, from Sudan? Are they back?
Look, actually, like a lot of people, after the First World War, when they tried some of them to come back, they were not allowed back by the British mandate because they were considered turcos.
Yes.
They were coming from they had travel papers from the enemy state. But then 1948 happened. And of course, we are not refugees, we're Bethlehemites. Where I'm talking to you now is my great great grandfather's house. But we lost a lot of our property in what then became Israel. And that never encouraged anybody to come back. Now, what I got from the influences I got from all of these travels are things in my cooking, are things in how I treat spices. Are, for example, we have a cousin one of the sisters of these five brothers, so my father's aunt, got married to an Italian. And in our cuisine at home, we've integrated a few Italian dishes that we still do. And, we don't just do an international version of an Italian dish. One of them is something like broccioli, which is a rolled piece of veal with some cheese and parsley inside. I mean, there's things like this that stayed. Um,
Well, we have a family here that migrated from Palestine, and they're the Benedettos, and they
ah,
are Italian Palestinians.
but you
They,
know what Benedetto is? Originally in Arabic, it's Mubarak.
uh-huh,
And so
yes,
they may be
blessed.
originally a
Ble-
Mubarak family from Bethlehem that then became the Italian Palestinians with Benedetto, of course.
Yes, yes,
That's the beauty of travel and the the way people traveled at that time, which is it was a slow travel, and you had the
yes,
time to discover, to learn, to be influenced, which today is less and less the reality. Today we think we visited a country if we spent 4 days in it.
yes, fast,
And
right.
that's not how things were.
And I'm a fan of Indian cuisine. And I'm so amazed of the way they deal with spices. I don't know if you remember that when I visited you, I was asking you about the spices and that I wanted to go back because I needed to learn about that background because it's so sacred for the Indians. And the way you treat spices before you cook, it brings in all the flavor. So I would like to know, what is that link? How do we link that to the spice trade, the Silk Road, bringing in and
Well,
carrying spices all around?
there's
What did we
two.
learn?
Well, what did we learn as Palestinians? We actually have a lot of spices that came through that. To take the
Yes,
most visible example, it's cardamom. Our coffee has cardamom in it, but
yes,
cardamom is not a native spice to here, and it came with the spice route. Coffee itself came with the spice route. While today it's a very much integrated to our life, but also it's become a ritual of hospitality that came with the spice route. how we treat spices, and that's very interesting. Because we've talked about it a bit in the past. In Palestinian cuisine, especially when we're talking about things like stews, which are quite a big component of our cuisine, what happens is the spices are added onto the meat and liquid, so the broth happening. While what I have done is I've gone back to the Indian bit of it, and I fry my spices, and they
Yes.
release this majestic flavor. Funnily
Uh-huh.
enough, there's one spice that you don't fry, and it's sumac
Yes.
because it burns.
Uh-huh.
Um, and it is my favorite spice. So, but things like, the base of any Palestinian cooked meat is usually the meat is cooked with cardamom, cinnamon, and bay leaves.
How about the
While
seven
the
spices? Always people say, "Oh, the seven spices, the seven spices." That
I don't
depends
know
on the
what seven
house.
spices is. I don't know what seven spices is. I I have been asked this question a million times. You met with me, our friend Tawfiq Al-Ama, the spice master. He does
Mhm.
have something that looks like, he calls it bhar tabikh,
Yes.
cooking spice.
Uh-huh.
And he makes his mix. I personally don't. What I do is I mix the spices I think are adapted. I really have a problem with these spices
Ready-made
that are already
mix.
mixed,
Yes.
because each different produce has a different requirement. So the marriage of these spices is fantastic.
Hmm.
Nutmeg and black pepper and allspice and cardamom and cumin, coriander, like all of this works. But then how do you dose it? If you're doing the makluba with chicken, I think the chicken flavor does not carry a lot of allspice because allspice
Right.
is extremely powerful. While if you're
Hmm.
doing a slow cooked lamb, you can go wild with your allspice and it'll work. So
Right.
I prefer usually dosing them. I don't do the seven rule. You know, there's something with our cuisine. Our cuisine was never written down historically. I'm speaking. In the
Hmm.
last 2 years, we've seen Palestinian cookbooks, but historically, it wasn't written down. And how were recipes transmitted? It was
Yes.
the words are kamsha, which means a handful, and
Uh-huh.
rasha, which means sparkle. What does this mean in grams? I don't know.
Right.
And so I think there's a lot of this spontaneous transmission. I'm sure,
How
Andrea,
about
if you're cooking,
i-
yeah,
you're taking me, you're sorry to interrupt. You're taking me back to a book, Kitab
hmm,
al-Tabiq.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and how did that book influence our food? Because sometimes we say we received or you received the heritage from the Ottomans, but it's not so. We received our heritage from different places and from the Arabic Peninsula. And in our case, well, the Levantine is so rich in produce that we created our own food. So, how is this book? How is it representing our traditions, our origins, maybe?
I'm going to take you way before this book.
Okay.
One of the cooking methods we have is called zarb, which is making a hole in the ground, lighting a fire,
Uh
and
huh.
once that fire is hot and no more flames, we put the meat inside it and cover it and
Uh
let
huh.
it slow cook. This comes from the Samaritans cooking in what they call the tanur, which is, and they still do it today on the mountain in Nablus, and it's way before monotheistic religions. I mean, the Samaritans and the Jews arrived at the same time, more or less. I mean, the first five books of the Old Testament. So that is way before all of this. The Ottomans did not create our cuisine. The Ottomans were actually, for 400 years here in all of that Levant
Mm-hmm.
area. And like a lot of empires, cuisine from the different places in the empire traveled to the capital, to Constantinople, and then was redistributed sometimes. But that is the same with any country that had an empire. I mean, look at the Spanish cuisine. A
Yes.
lot of produce you find today in Spanish cuisine came from
Yes.
the ships that came back. In our case, what I really think was the key, Kitab al-Tabikh was part of that documentation of history. But as you very correctly said, you said in that area there's a lot of produce. I will go even more in detail and say every village, every city has a very different terroir, and that terroir has influenced that cuisine. I
Yes, because
cannot say
Palestine has so
I feel you're
microclimates.
100%. If you're from Gaza, you have had the influence of the sea.
My Gaza kitchen, it's
Exactly,
fascinating. It's fascinating to see
exactly,
so many things from the sea. It's something that people
exactly.
here might not even think about, that we do have seafood and fish, and we have that's part of our culture.
Exactly. But why do people not think that today? It's for two reasons. One is a lot of the Palestinians that went to Chile went from the central area, from Bethlehem, Beit Jala,
Yes.
and then Beit Hahor in Jerusalem, but mainly Bethlehem, Beit Jala, where our food tradition was not fish linked.
No.
And then since 1948 and then 67 and then the construction of the segregation wall, we as Palestinians here have also been disconnected with the sea. The last time I was in Gaza was in 1987. So that makes a disconnect, and how often do you use fresh fish becomes a different story. I mean,
Right.
I was talking about this a few days ago with somebody who has a shop here in Bethlehem, and I was saying, look, I don't get it. You're selling more bacalao, dried fish than I've ever seen. And he said, yeah, a lot of people don't even know what fresh fish looks like today. I
Right.
mean, there are a few places that sell fish, but it's not as present as in places like Jaffa, like Gaza, like Haifa, where this was traditionally present. So really, our cuisine is the microclimates, is
Yes.
the beauty of these
Rules.
microclimates. Right now in the north of the West Bank, they are picking olives. Here, we're not yet picking olives. We will be picking olives in a few days' time. Even those like very small differences make a difference. You come from Beit Jala. You have the best mishmish in the world,
Yes.
but
Well,
it's
that
a
is
choice.
something that they said, they usually say here when our the grandparents and they came. It was so typical that they say, "Oh no, but fruit in Palestine is mishmash al kadde or al batih
Yeah,
al kadde," and everything was al kadde, and it was
yeah.
so funny because they said, "Well, here Chile is so similar. The central zone of Chile, Santiago, is so similar to Palestine. However, in spite of that, they all had a fight with their largest fruit and the sweetest and the best and it was even though the other day I heard you talk about the sarur,
Hmm.
that
Yeah,
is
yeah,
loquat,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
And that is so common in Chile. We call it níspero, which is
Wow.
Japanese. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
Japanese loquat. And the níspero is, we're filled with that. So you gave me such a great idea because at our loquat season, I will start doing some things that you were talking about. So it's
And in
very, very
Palestine,
related.
this season we don't have zarur.
Oh,
So you see, that's where the diaspora is also very interesting with food, is because in different climates, people have adapted their cuisine. They've had to use what was local. And by doing so, sometimes they've either changed the recipe or, on the contrary, preserved the recipe. When you're talking about the mishmish halkadda and the batih halkadda, what were they talking about? They were talking about the memories of home.
yes, saudade in Portuguese,
Exactly.
saudade.
Exactly. Yes, yes, of course. And that is not something we can neither measure nor quantify. It's a bit of the fantasy of the homeland. It's a bit of, it's a mix of all of this. An idea of home, because if we look at Palestinians
Yes.
in Chile, most of them are fourth, fifth generation.
Yes.
And what where does this feeling come from? It comes from the stories of their grandparents and the stories of their parents. It's not even something very often, it's not something they've experienced. And then when they come here and experience it, that's where it just becomes
It
an
rounds up. It
explosion.
rounds up.
I,
The
exactly,
insight.
exactly.
The
I have this,
insight appears.
I have a friend in Chile who I remember when the first time he came here, and actually I think the only time he came here, he would always tell me about the shushbarak his mother was cooking, and it always looked nice. And so I figured that's one of the things we don't really need to introduce him to because he's had it at home there for years. And actually, the first time he had a shushbarak here, he just went like, "That's it." And I was like, "No, but what your mother was cooking is also that's it. It's also the same thing with the adaptation of difference, of course."
But I think we are a bit far from what really is the terroir, what really is Palestine, and what really is Palestinian food. So take me to this picture that I have behind.
That is, for me, that's the meaning of where I start my days every day. So that is the entrance to the market of Bethlehem. And the fantastic lady sitting on the right with her produce is Nabil. I call her the queen of herbs because she comes from a village south of Bethlehem. She's been coming there for 40 years. And she brings produce that either she's planted or her neighbors have planted. And for me, it gives the tempo of the market. It gives the tempo
There,
of what I'm
there
cooking
she
that
is.
day in my restaurant.
Uh-huh.
But what you were saying about the cuisine being a bit far, for me, I actually had the opposite reaction. I remember the first time somebody from Chile talked to me about masarin. And I was like, what? You
Mazarin.
eat masarin in Chile? Exactly. I
Yes,
didn't think that would have worked, that would have survived. The,
it does because this is what they
the
eat in barbecues in the Argentinians, the Chileans, and now they stuff it. The key for many people in Chile is to cook the mazarin and then toss it with a little bit of butter or oil and then serve it.
yeah, you see, so but there are things that you've also, as you said, because you're far, that they've not traveled well. Things like dried yogurt, laban jamid, which is
Yes,
not something
yes.
that's really present in Chile, while it's essential to Palestinian cuisine. But maybe what I think and why Ibn Nadir in the picture in the background is also important. We have a cuisine that's built on the rhythm of seasons and micro seasons within the seasons. While when you transport that cuisine to another type of environment, whether it's similar or not, but we're talking about two different hemispheres at the end. We're talking about
Right.
two different exposures to sun. It's the terroir, the whole idea of a terroir is the basics of a terroir are the soil, the exposure to sun, the slant, the indigenous seed that went there, and it's exactly the same as for vines that are used to produce wine. It's
Right.
in Bordeaux on some hills you're allowed to call it Bordeaux on one side and not Bordeaux on the other. And these are it's not mulukhiyah for the sake of mulukhiyah. It's mulukhiyah because it's a good mulukhiyah and because in summer that's where it's growing all over. Now,
Right.
I think that has changed the paradigm with how we relate to our cuisine. Sadly, in the diaspora, the cuisine was one of the most important elements of preserving one's identity,
Yes.
while in Palestine, cuisine was one of the ones that had the less attention given to it
Mm-hmm.
because we took it for granted.